words of the poet Robert Frost, "These woods are lovely, dark, and deep." Perhaps no words describe the solitude and peacefulness of Hawley and its surrounding area as well as these. If you've never heard of Hawley, don't worry, most people haven't, and maybe it's better that way. Much of its charm is in its remoteness, and its connection to the centuries-old pioneer era of the Pacific Northwest. When I started researching this area's local history a year and a half ago, I didn't expect to find more than a few minutes worth of content about it. Something along the lines of, Hawley has been the same quaint, close-knit community since loggers moved into the area in the 1800s. The end. But I was completely wrong. Visiting Hawley today, you would never guess that it was once a bustling sawmill town, with inhabitants from all over the world and a daily connection to Seattle by boat. What's more surprising is that Hawley's even smaller neighboring community to the north, Nalita, apparently once appeared on world maps when it barely shows up on local maps today. After learning that this unassuming place had such a rich history, I was hooked. I had to know what was once here and why there's no trace of it today. Having explored the area in person, scoured historic maps for hours, and read numerous books and articles on local history, I'll do my best to paint a picture of what life was once like along this picturesque coast of the Hood Canal, and why there's no remaining traces of this bygone era. To give you a bit of context for Hawley and its geography, Hawley is an unincorporated community of a few dozen, mostly summer-only residents, situated on the Kitsap Peninsula along the Hood Canal. Hawley is about 20 miles away from any substantial town, although there is a gas station and a few small shops within about 10 miles. I will be primarily focusing on Hawley for this video, but it's hard to dive into Hawley's history without mentioning two other nearby communities, Nalita and Seabeck. These three communities are roughly aligned north to south along the Hood Canal, with Seabeck being the most notable of the three, both currently and historically. Because of this, Nalita and Hawley are considered a part of Seabeck for most official purposes. Also, before we get started, I want to give a completely unsponsored and not affiliated in any way shout out to this book, Seabeck and the Surrounding Area by Fred Just. A lot of the information I learned as I was making this video came from this book, and although it's fairly colloquial overall, this book is probably the most comprehensive resource on Hawley's history out there. Now, let's get into it. Before the mid-1800s, Hawley and its surrounding area were utilized by many Native American tribes, although there is no evidence of permanent settlements in the area. Most likely, indigenous peoples based across the Hood Canal used canoes to frequently travel to the Kitsap Peninsula, adding the peninsula's resources to their capabilities. But in 1856, a man named Marshall Blinn would change the area forever, when he chose Seabeck's natural harbor as a location for his lumber mill. Lumber was an extremely lucrative resource in the 1850s, and the untouched, lush forests along the Hood Canal may as well have been a gold mine. As Seabeck was growing into a thriving logging town, naturally, loggers, homesteaders, and explorers coming to Seabeck started spilling over into nearby areas. A few inland communities eventually sprung up, like Crosby, Hinceville, and Heights Center, but the incredibly dense woods of the Pacific Northwest made travel by boat exponentially more viable than traversing the wild swamps, mountains, and vegetation inland. This naturally encouraged settlers toward what became Hawley, and soon a Dutch sailor named William Anderson and his Native American wife Mary became the area's first residents. Later in 1889, the Englishman Robert Wyatt, his wife Ellen, and their family settled in the area on a 145-acre homestead. They brought with them some Hawley seedlings from England, which thrived and eventually gave the area its name in 1893 when the Wyatts petitioned for a post office to be set up near their homestead and they had to choose a name for it. Once the post office was established, a store, school, and community hall also opened, and soon secluded Hawley became a magnet for industry. In the early 1900s, the Riverside Timber Company started logging in the area, and thus built a railroad from Hawley a few miles into the forest near where Hinceville is today. The railroad system out near Hawley is one of the most surprising things I learned about while researching Hawley, because hardly a trace of them is left. Hawley's railroad was just one pathway in a whole network of railroad tracks between Seabeck and Hawley that were used for logging in the early 1900s. This network of railroad tracks was mostly used for transporting lumber to and from a logging camp in a place known today as Camp Union. In its heyday, Camp Union was a huge logging operation with its own ambulance service, 2 taverns, a store, and bunkhouses provided by by the logging company, but today there's a gas station, pizzeria, and saloon. I would say that not even a hint of this once crucial railroad network exists today, but that's not entirely true. It's my understanding that the railroad bridge that spanned Big Beef Creek near Camp Union finally collapsed a few years ago, and its remains are still back in the woods somewhere. Although they are most certainly on private property, so unless you're looking to invest in some real estate, I'd urge you not to go looking for them. In addition to Hawley's lumber industry, a can opener factory and shingle mill were also opened in Hawley in the early 1900s. This is probably what I would say is Hawley's peak. It was a lively town with industry, education, and community. It had a daily connection to Seattle by boat, and for the most part it was a peaceful community. A few miles to the north, Nolita was also as bustling as it ever got. It had a post office, store, hotel, and its own connection to Seattle by boat. But even farther north, Seabeck, which once rivaled Seattle in size, was reeling from a massive fire a few years prior, which eventually led to Hawley's demise as well. A few years prior, in 1886, sparks from the Riveter, one of the ships which frequented Seabeck's harbor, caught the nearby hay barn on fire. Since hay is pretty flammable to say the least, the fire spread to the lumber stacks and then both sawmills, and since you could probably also say that wood is pretty flammable, there was no stopping the fire at this point. The blaze burned so hot that apples on the trees of the local orchard were cooked on their branches. This fire completely doomed Seabeck, not just because its sole industry was wiped out, but also because the news spread like wildfire, pun intended, discouraging loggers from sourcing their wood from Seabeck. A Seattle Times article from August 12, 1886 reports the incident. Seabeck in ashes. The great mills licked up by devouring flames. 3 hours of infernal heat and flames of 300,000 feet of lumber burnt. First by telegram and then by Josephine this afternoon. This news that the great mills at Seabeck had been destroyed yesterday afternoon by fire. The whistle at about 2 o'clock was the first warning that workmen about the mill and the citizens of the little village had of the impending disaster. 10 minutes later, large piles of lumber were throwing great tongues of flames high into the air. A large storehouse filled with hay burned, and from there the fire spread to the 2 mills, water tank, machine shop, carpenter shop, and other buildings. Indeed, the site was swept as with a cyclone, leaving only the twisted machinery standing silent amidst the desolation. The slab piles underneath the wharves are still burning, and the air is still laden with heavy smoke and cinders. Indeed, this fire is certainly the defining moment in Seabeck's history, effectively turning it into a ghost town for a few decades. Since Hawley was in a way still a suburb of Seabeck, Seabeck's demise, along with Washington State's movement into other types of industry besides logging, directly led to the collapse of Hawley's industry. By 1926, the school, cemetery, and some houses were all that remained of this once bustling community. If you visit Hawley and look around today, it is just as beautiful as it ever was, but you won't find anything that harkens to what was once here. There's a collection of houses and a private boat launch in Hawley proper, and the Hawley Cemetery is up a steep hill and tucked into the woods above the neighborhood. There's also Anderson Cove behind an unnamed point along the Hood Canal, and the old Hawley School still stands as a community center. But other than that, there's not much to see. I wasn't able to find anything on whatever happened to the sawmill, can opener factory, post office, or shingle mill, and there's no remnants of the railroad to be found either. Perhaps one vestige of the old days are the apple trees growing wild at Anderson Cove, probably a remnant of orchards planted on a homestead. Nolita is even more unassuming today, with the only visible reminder of what once was being Nolita Road, which heads towards where the old Nolita community was, although not all the way down to the water. From what I understand, the building that was once the Nolita Post Office still stands today and is known locally as the Net Shed. The Nolita Post Office closed in 1924 after functioning for only 24 years next to a pier and boat repair shop. I couldn't find any pictures of what it looks like today, and since it's on private property, I'm not going to try to visit it, and neither should you. Seabeck has become a charming little community itself, with magnificent views of the Olympic Mountains over the Hood Canal and a busy conference center. There's also a general store, gift shop, coffee shop, and pizzeria, which are all loved by locals and tourists alike. If you want to visit Seabeck, there's a bed and breakfast, state park, and county park, all with stunning views. The county park, Guillemot Cove, is worthy of mention not only for its beauty, but for its preservation of old-growth stumps from Seabeck's logging days, still standing old-growth maple trees, and pear and apple trees from a 1940s homestead. Guillemot Cove is also famous for its stump house, which, according to local legend, housed an escaped convict named Dirty Thompson in the late 1800s. Another fun fact about Guillemot Cove, I think Walmart sells canvas prints of the old-growth maple trees for about $60. As a self-professed connoisseur of overlooked places, I will always be fascinated by Holly. Not quite a ghost town, not a victim of its own success, but maybe somewhere that was just never meant to be a bustling city. So much of Holly's charm is in its natural beauty, remoteness, and peacefulness. I would argue that if it had continued to flourish, it wouldn't be nearly as wonderful a place as it is today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you do decide to go out to Holly, please be mindful of what roads are public versus private. Holly's extraordinary beauty is truly unique, and its forgotten history only enhances this wonderful place.